Through the thick, overgrown forests, the last rays of the sun danced on the uneven ground, creating long, spooky shadows. Once a peaceful haven for hikers and environmentalists, the area had long been neglected and taken over by relentless reclamation of nature. It was here, in this abandoned place, that a grisly discovery would set off a sequence of events, resulting in a sad disintegration of once apparently perfect marriage. The call arrived late in the evening. A hiker had come upon something odd in the forest. Originally thinking of the skeletal remains of an animal, he discovered that they were human bones, half buried in a small grave. The hiker had turned back and left, just the grim evidence by the time the local police showed up. Although the skeletal remains were too old for a straightforward identification, the authorities understood this was not an accident. Here, something awful had happened. Their task was to find the truth. Led by seasoned investigator Detective Quan Shu, renowned for his exacting attention to detail, the investigative team arrived at the scene rapidly. Quan, a man of few words but great ideas, felt right away that this case was different from any he had handled. Hidden from prying eyes, the sight of the body suggested a deliberate act, an act motivated by desperation, or maybe something even darker. Seeking to identify the victim, forensic anthropology was called in to examine the skeletal remains. After days of meticulous investigation, the anthropologists were able to put together a crude profile. The victim was male, most likely in his late 30s to early 40s, and had been dead for about a year. Though more sinister, a fracture in the skull, a blow suggestive of foul play, his identity remained a mystery until more study of the bones. Detective Quan and his colleagues started to put the last known movements of the victim together as the inquiry went on. Their efforts resulted in a quiet suburban neighborhood where the victim, who they now knew as Leo Andreev, had lived with his wife Nadia for more than 7 years. Leo had been reported missing almost a year ago, his disappearance first attributed to a midlife crisis or a wish to start over somewhere else. But as the team dug further, Nadia's account began to show contradictions, gaps in her chronology, inexplicable financial transactions, and, most importantly, a dramatic change in her behavior once Leo vanished. Not the usual bereaved widow was Nadia Andreev. She had carried on living as though nothing had happened, even picking up a dog soon after Leo vanished. Her neighbors said she was distant, nearly frigid, and showed little interest in talking about her husband's disappearance. This behavior by itself might not have sparked questions, but taken in context with the forensic data, it presented a troubling picture. Working for a nearby fashion house as a textile designer kept Nadia occupied and let her travel regularly. Leo had vanished, or so she said, during one of these travels. Further looking at her alibis, though, showed she had not been out of town as she had reported to the police. Rather, her credit card records revealed purchases at a hardware store, that is, goods like duct tape, heavy-duty plastic sheeting, and cleaning supplies. When asked about these, Nadia stayed cool and said they were for a home remodeling project Leo had in mind. Quan, though, was dubious. Not only did the physical data cause concern, there were also the whispers among Leo's friends and colleagues, suggesting years of trouble in the marriage. Leo reportedly told a close friend about his wife's mounting unhappiness in their marriage. He had even mentioned a strange scheme he had developed, one he thought might revive their declining love, a temporary partner swap, something he felt could liven their life. When he brought it up to Nadia, though, she had responded with cold wrath rather than curiosity or entertainment. She grew more distant, fixated on the belief that her husband had mentally checked out of their marriage, seeing the suggestion as a great betrayal, a sign that Leo no longer loved her. Quan kept excavating and came upon something even more troubling. A neighbor who had seen something odd on the night Leo disappeared, a big black plastic bag being loaded into Nadia's car, came forward to testify. At the time, the neighbor had not given it much thought, presuming it was old clothing for donation or garbage. But now, with the body discovered, the memory became far more sinister. The last discovery in the case came from forensic botanists brought in to investigate the soil discovered on Leo's remains. The study turned up unusual markers, traces of a rare plant only found in particular areas of the region, in the soil around Leo's grave. The same plant was discovered in soil samples taken from Nadia's garden. closely linked to the scene of Leo's body discovery. Detective Kwon knew they had enough to arrest Nadia armed with this data. He was aware, though, that this was only starting point. Kwon thought it almost impossible to get a confession from the shrewd woman Nadia was. But he couldn't get rid of the impression that there was still more to this tale, something darker and more complex than a straightforward case of marital betrayal and murder. As he ready to bring her in, sitting in the darkly lit interrogation room, Nadia Andreev had a stone-like facial. Detective Kwon Shu watched her closely across from her, his keen eyes looking for any slippage in her composure. Though Kwon knew that evidence by itself would not be sufficient, the mounting proof against her was evidence. He needed a confession, or, at minimum, a mistake. Something that would clearly link her to the murder of her husband. The quiet between them hung thick with unresolved conflict. Having questioned hundreds of suspects over his career, Kwon knew that often the best weapon was silence. People hated silence. They dreaded it. In silence, they were left alone with their thoughts, guilt, and weight of their actions. Nadia, though, seemed unconcerned by it, as though she had been getting ready for this for a long time. At last, Kwon broke the quiet. "You were rather close with Leo, weren't you?" His voice cool and measured as he asked. Though her eyes wavered, Nadia stayed calm. "We were married for 7 years, she said, her tone carefully neutral. Kwon said, reclining in his chair and looking back over a long period. "You had to have known one another rather well. If something were wrong with him, or if he was unhappy, I suppose you would have seen." Nadia wrinkled her forehead slightly, but she straightened it fast. "Leo was complicated," she said gently. "Like everyone else, he had moods. Still, we were glad, as much as any couple could be after 7 years. Kwon nodded, as though weighing her comments. "Still, he proposed something quite unusual to you. Did he not? I think he referred to a partner swap." This time Nadia's composure broke ever so slightly. Her eyes closed and her lips became a thin line. That was just a dumb concept he had. He took no great seriousness about it. "But you were offended by it," Kwon said gently. "You saw it as a betrayal then?" The fury in Nadia's eyes shone. "It was nasty," she said, snapping. "While he might have considered it a joke, I did not. It revealed to me his actual impressions of me, of us, that he no longer cared, that he was bored with me." Kwon slanted forward, his eyes sharp. "Did it set you off, Nadia? Angry enough to wish to harm him?" Nadia stiffened, fingers closing into fists on the table, her voice low and menacing. "I didn't kill Leo," she said. "I loved him, even if he occasionally was an idiot." "Loved him enough to cover his disappearance?" Quietly, Kwon asked. "Loved him enough to lie about where you were the night he disappeared? Loved him enough to hope no one would never ever find his body buried in the woods?" Nadia's breath choked, and Kwon momentarily thought he had her. She then drew a long breath, her face hardening once more. "I told you, I didn't kill Leo," she steely-voiced repeated. "And you lack evidence that I did." Kwon watched her for a moment, and then nodded gently. "You're right," he said at last. "There is not clear evidence here. Still, we have enough to complicate things greatly for you, enough to cause a jury to second-guess, allowing you to walk free." Nadia said nothing while staring at a spot on the table in front of her. As Kwon tried to decide her next action, she could see the wheels spinning in her head, the computations and tactics. She was smart. He had to say that. Kwon knew everyone had a breaking point, though he had been working in this field for a considerable period. Finding it turned out to be the challenge. The door to the interrogation room opened as Kwon got ready to ask his next question, and his partner, Detective Marla Sanchez, entered. She was grimacing and carrying a folder. "Kwon, we need to talk," she said, looking at Nadia, then back at her boyfriend. Kwon turned away himself and trailed Marla down the hall. "What is it?" Keeping a low voice, he asked. Marla passed the folder to him. She said, her voice grave, "We found something. You will want to see this." Opening the file, Kwon started reading the report within. As he looked over the page, the bits of the puzzle started to fit in his head. The proof was damning, and it was exactly what they needed to tear down Nadia's meticulously put on front. Inside the folder included a thorough report from a forensic accountant looking over Leo and Nadia's finances. Among the regular bank statements and credit card transactions, one entry caught my attention. a sizable withdrawal from Leo's personal savings account, made just a few days before he vanished. The withdrawal was in cash, and the sum begged questions. More intriguing, though, was what happened next. The money had been transferred under Nadia's name into a fresh account she had opened just days before Leo vanished. Closing the folder, Kwon experienced a flash of success. Their needed break was this one. The financial path was clear. Nadia had been organizing something, and it was not only a renovation job. The withdrawal, the revised story, the falsehoods about her location, all pointed to one result. Nadia had gone to great effort to hide her tracks and had been intending to get rid of Leo. Her well-crafted narrative was starting to fall apart, though, now. Kwon knew he could break her with the correct pressure. He could see the cracks developing. Kwon felt eager as he and Marla went back to the interrogation room. He had been waiting for this, the moment the truth would at last surface. He only needed to prod Nadia a little bit to cause her to slip and expose the gloom hiding under her composed front. But Kwon couldn't get rid of the sensation he felt, something deeper, something more sinister, as he settled across from Nadia. Smart as Nadia was, she had been preparing this for some time. But what had propelled her to such extremes? What had at last sent her over the brink? Kwon could feel the near answers. He would, however, have to play the long game if he were to acquire them. And the game wasn't quite finished with Nadia Andreev. Though Detective Kwon Shu's mind was still racing, even the interrogation had stopped for the day. He found trouble with Nadia Andreev's icy attitude and deliberate answers. She had obviously been planning something for a long period, but the reason behind her behavior stayed elusive. Kwon knew that Nadia had planned her husband's murder, but the why was just as crucial as the how. Kwon had to delve further into their past, a past that had seemed ordinary until now. To grasp the whole extent of the crime, Kwon and Detective Marla Sanchez started threading Leo and Nadia's life together back at the station. They began with the obvious, a look at the couple's family, friends, and acquaintances. Their discovery of a web of strained relationships and severed ties suggested that the marriage of the Andreevs had been anything from ideal. Leo Andreev had been a successful software engineer, well liked in his field, but his work sometimes kept him far from his house. Conversely, Nadia had developed her profession in the artistic field of textile design. The couple seemed to be in turmoil in their personal life, even if they were successful professionally. While Nadia was often shown as domineering and sharp-tongued, friends said Leo was quiet and remote. Taken together, they painted a picture of a couple whose distance over time had grown. One especially memorable interview for Kwon was with a former friend of Nadia's, Ilona, a woman who had once collaborated with her in the fashion business. Nadia, according to Ilona, is incredibly aspirational and would not hesitate to use people to achieve her goals. But Kwon noticed a passing remark made by Ilona. "I remember Nadia once said something unusual," Ilona said, her voice deliberate. "We were discussing relationships when she informed me she wouldn't forgive anyone who ever betrayed her. She said she would make them pay regardless of the circumstances." Kwon recorded this down. The words kept coming back to him. Although Nadia's response to Leo's proposal for a partner swap had been one of indignation, it was starting to seem as though that moment had merely set off something far more. A long-buried resentment, or maybe even a deliberate strategy. But what had driven her such obsession with treachery? Kwon grew more certain that Nadia's past had molded her into the cold, calculated woman she had become, the more he considered it. Kwon told Marla to research Nadia's past, in search of any noteworthy events that might help explain her behavior. Marla found something shockingly and quite disturbing. Nadia had not always been Andreev. Born in a small, far-off village, Nadia Chlekova was tragic events dominated her early life. Her father had been a well-known man in the village, a man with a strong temper and a taste for gambling. Nadia's father had been involved in a crime, a robbery gone bad that had claimed a local retailer's life when Nadia was a teenager. From the incident, Nadia and her family were severely ostracized from the community. Unable to deal with the guilt, Nadia's mother had committed suicide not too long after, leaving Nadia to look after herself. These occasions had obviously had a profound impact on Nadia. Nadia had moved to the city following the death of her mother, redefining herself in every manner imaginable. She changed her name, studied design, and cut herself apart from her background. Still, the scars stayed under the surface, driving her to succeed at all means, and feeding her obsessive fear of betrayal. Kwon could now see how Leo's advice might have brought old hurts for Nadia back to life. To her, the concept of a partner swap was a reminder of the life she had tried so hard to flee. A life marred by betrayal, violence, and loss. Not only a misguided attempt to save their marriage. Leo's suggestion had to have felt like the ultimate betrayal, a clue that the life she had created was falling apart all around her. Kwon still had to link these emotional undercurrents to the crime itself, though. He and Marla came upon more unsettling information as they kept trying to fit the puzzle. In the months before Leo vanished, Nadia had seen a psychiatrist, a Dr. Miriam Hartman. Although Dr. Hartman had prescribed Nadia meds for anxiety and depression, her notes showed Nadia had been dealing with more than just career pressure. She had shown signs of paranoia, worries that Leo was about to leave her, and a developing fixation with control. It became abundantly evident that Nadia's mental state had dropped quickly during the year before Leo's death. Her once-ordered life had started to spiral out of control, and in her mind, the only way to restore that control was to cut off Leo personally, the cause of her strife. Kwon examined the facts and came to see Nadia's actions had been a deliberate attempt to remove Leo from her life in a way she felt would leave her untouchable. All of the financial transactions, the new account, the lies about her alibis, all of which had been part of a well-thought-out strategy. Nadia had, however, undervalued one thing: the human component. Her misjudging of how others around her would have seen her behavior would finally be her undoing. Kwon knew it was time to confront Nadia with the whole weight of the evidence when the pieces at last started to line up. He was aware, though, that this confrontation would be unique from all others. Nadia was a woman who had been profoundly damaged by her past, one that had finally caught up with her in the most terrible of ways. She was not only a killer. Kwon felt foreboding as he got ready to bring Nadia back in for interrogation. The truth was beginning to show, but it also made one realize this case dealt more than just justice. It was about knowing the sinister and twisted reasons a woman had killed her husband, a woman who, in many respects, had been as much a victim of her own life as Leo had been of her crime. Kwon knew the confrontation would be the most difficult, but also the last piece of the jigsaw. Nadia Andreev had lived her life on a basis of lies and dishonesty, but now that basis was collapsing, and the truth was about to be revealed. Standing at the edge of the interrogation room, Detective Kwon Shu's mind flew with the specifics that had brought him to this point. The stakes were great, and he understood that his approach with Nadia Andreev would be delicate dance. He had to play his cards exactly, not too strong, not too forgiving. The intention was to let Nadia realize her well-crafted story was disintegrating and the walls were closing in around her. He inhaled deeply, then opened the door. Sitting at the table, Nadia had a stiff posture and a mask of calm, apathetic facial expression. But Kwon could see the strain in her eyes and the slight finger twitch. She had every reason to be nervous, though. Laying the folder with the fresh evidence on the table between them, Kwon sat across from her. He let it sit there, a silent reminder of what was ahead, not open right away. The room was still, the air thick with expectancy. "We've been going over the evidence again, and we've found some things that don't add up," Kwon said, his voice steady but with an undercurrent of firmness. "Events suggesting a quite different narrative than the one you have been sharing with us." Nadia turned her eyes back to Kwon and then to the folder. She answered, her voice betraying a trace of impatience. "I've already told you everything I know." Kwon nodded slowly, as if weighing her comments. "You have indeed told us a lot." He stopped, leaning slightly, "and we have some gaps and inconsistencies to work through. Leo, for instance, made a sizable cash withdrawal just before he vanished. That money was credited under your name into a new account, one opened just a few days before he disappeared." Nadia's face stayed the same, but Kwon felt the strain in her jaw. "That money was for our renovation," she said austerely. "Leo wanted it kept apart from our joint account." Kwon asked, an eyebrow. "A renovation? Your financial records show different from that. Actually, there is no evidence of any remodeling occurring around that period." But what we observe is a trend. You are progressively but definitely separating from Leo. One thing Nadia points to: the new account, the hardware store purchases, the lies about your whereabouts when he vanished. Nadia's eyes narrowed, and for the first time her composure seemed to waver. And detective, what would that be? Quan answered after leaning back and allowing the silence to envelop him. It suggests premeditation. It suggests that you have been long planning this. And it suggests you killing Leo, since you couldn't stand the thought of him leaving you. Nadia's lips drew in a thin line, her eyes flickering with rage. That's ridiculous, she hissed. Leo was not killed by me. I loved him. Quan showed no flinching. He knew this was the time he had to push her, make her face the reality she had been dodging confrontable. Love him? Quan asked again, his voice cool but sharp. You loved him so much that, just a few months before he vanished, you opened a life insurance policy in his name. You lied to us about where you were the night he disappeared because you loved him so much. You buried his body in the forest because you loved him so much and hoped nobody would ever find it. The charge hung in the air, and Nadia looked as though she might explode for a split second. Then something changed in her face. The wrath subsided to something colder, more deliberate. You think you have it all figured out? Not so sure. Nadia answered with a low, almost whisper-like voice. You believe you know everything about Leo, about our life together, about me. But you, detective, do not. You are clueless. Quan looked at her, not intimidated. Then why, Nadia, do you not enlighten me? Tell me what I am ignorant about. Nadia paused, and then did not reply. Her eyes sharp and relentless, she fixed Quan. Then slowly a smile twisted at the corners of her mouth, a smile that chilled Quan's spine. You want to know why I did it? Her voice was shockingly calm as she asked. You really do want to know? Quan nodded, keeping his voice steady. Surely I do. Lying back in her chair, Nadia crossed her arms over her chest. Leo was not the man you imagine him to be. He seemed frail, pathetic. He wanted to pretend we were something we weren't, play these small games to liven our marriage, and have fun. He believed he could shape me into doing whatever he wanted. He could control me. But he was mistaken. So very incorrect. Quan paid close attention, each word supporting his misgivs. Nadia was driven by power, control, and a deep-seated need to dominate her husband, not by fear or desperation. He was supposed to be leaving me, Nadia said, her voice getting colder with every word. He was going to grab our house, our money, our life. For what also? He could then dash off with some younger woman, some tramp he came across on internet. She spat the words with venom. I meant to stop that from happening, to create the life I deserve and get where I am. I have worked too hard. Not even Leo was going to take away that from me. Nobody else was either. As Nadia's confession poured out, Quan's head spun. The wrath, the resentment, the anxiety about losing control, all of which had combined to produce murder. Still one piece missing, though. One vital detail Quan needed to hear from her own lips absent. How did you approach it, Nadia? Quan asked quietly. How would you have killed Leo? Nadia said nothing for a protracted period. Her eyes locked on Quan's, as if she were weighing her alternatives and computing the hazards. She responded then, with a small shrug. Her tone was matter-of-fact. It wasn't hard, she said. Leo lived according to a pattern. Friday night he always visited the same pub and drank the same whiskey. I had to wait for him to arrive home drunk and blind. I understood he would not show any suspicion. As the last piece of the jigsaw clicked into place, Quan felt his pulse speed. I hit him, Nadia said, sounding detached. I gave him a hammer blow. Once gently at the rear of his head. He lacked even time to yell. After that, well, it was only a matter of tidy-up. Quan fixated on Nadia, her confession playing in his ears. She had done it. She had killed Leo in cold blood, with shockingly exact accuracy. But today, her carefully put-on front had collapsed, exposing the darkness below. Quan felt a range of emotions as he got ready to have Nadia taken into custody. A great sadness for the lives lost by this senseless act of violence mixed with relief that the case was at last solved. Though ultimately she had lost everything, Nadia Andreev had won her twisted game. There was no reversing. The truth was out. Kwon watched Nadia leave the interrogation room, her head held high and her demeanor as frigid and uncompromising as always. The cops escorted her. The case was closed, but the wounds left behind would last for a considerable period. For Nadia, there wouldn't be a second chance or redemption. Her fate was set. The life she had battled so valiantly vanished irrevocably. Nadia Andreev's trial rapidly turned into a spectacle, attracting great public and media interest. The public's imagination was captivated by the specifics of the case. An affluent couple's marriage turned fatal. A wife driven by dark impulses to kill her husband. Every day the courtroom was packed with people ready to see the drama playing out behind closed doors come to life. Carefully laying out the evidence Detective Kwon and his colleagues had found, the prosecution created a strong case against Nadia. They showed Nadia's covert behavior in the weeks before Leo's death. A sizable cash withdrawal, a new bank account, and dubious purchases, implying premeditation. They emphasized the forensic evidence, the distinctive soil samples linking Nadia to the burial site, the trace bloodstains discovered in the Andreev house after painstakingly cleaned but not totally eradicated. Most shockingly of all, they performed the playback of Nadia's confession, in which she coldly acknowledged bludgeoning her husband to death. Nadia's defense team sought to present a different picture, one of a woman driven to the brink by psychological manipulation and infidelity by her husband. Knowing full well how it would affect Nadia, they claimed Leo's suggestion of a partner swap had been a calculated attempt to compromise her mental stability. They presented Nadia as a victim of her husband's cruel games, a woman who had at last broken under years of emotional abuse. The jury was not moved, though. The confession was too chilling, the evidence too strong. Following a 3-week trial, the jury debated for just a few hours before rendering a guilty of first-degree murder decision. Nadia Andreev received a life-in-prison sentence, devoid of parole possibility. Nadia stayed austere and showed no feeling as the judge sentenced her, and she was escorted from the courtroom under handcuffs. Once revered for her beauty, talent, and apparently flawless life, the woman was now a convicted killer, sentenced to spend her days in a chilly, gray cell. The case stayed with Detective Kwon Shu. Over his career, he had solved numerous murders. This one had been different. He had been unsettled in ways he hadn't anticipated by the layers of dishonesty, cold calculation, and psychological complexity of Nadia's motives. He kept thinking about Nadia even after the trial, wondering how someone who had once been a victim of life's injustices could become a criminal of such a horrible nature. Kwon disagreed with Nadia's conviction. Although he knew justice had been done, the entire affair still carried a residual sense of tragedy. Dead, a life cut short by his wife's twisted sense of treachery. Leo Andreev Nadia was imprisoned. Her life was virtually over, and the crime's knock-on effects had extended well beyond the couple, touching friends, relatives, and even the entire community. The media turned to other tales and scandals, but for those who had been close to the case, the scars stayed. Trapped between grief for their lost son and resentment at the woman who had taken their son from them, Leo's family battled to accept his death. Although Nadia's former colleagues and friends pulled away from the scandal, rumors of her crime hung over everyone who had known her. Detective Kwon sought comfort in his work in the still aftermath of the trial. Though it couldn't reverse the damage done, he knew that every case he resolved brought some degree of closure to those left behind. But the Andreev case had left him with a sour taste, a reminder that occasionally there are no winners, even when justice is done. For most, the memory of the case vanished over the years, but not for Kwon. On his desk, he kept a file containing a reminder of the case that had tested him in ways he had not expected. Inside were the pictures, the documentation, Nadia's terrifying confession transcript. Most importantly, though, it served as a reminder of the frailty of the human psyche, of how quickly love could evolve into hate, and of how one moment of treachery might set off the unimaginable. Though he frequently worried about what had become of Nadia, Kwon never paid her a visit in prison. He pictured her living alone, her beauty and appeal lost behind bars. He questioned whether she ever considered Leo, whether she ever felt guilty about what she had done, or whether she stayed as clean as she had appeared during the trial. Quan knew ultimately that some questions would never be satisfactorily addressed. Though Leo and Nadia Andreev's case was closed, its echoes would linger in his mind for a protracted period. It was a tale of love gone wrong, of a woman driven to lunacy by her past and her worries, of a man who had paid the ultimate price for undervaluing the darkness that lay inside the person he thought he best knew, and of a story of love gone wrong. Quan glanced one last time at the pictures of Leo and Nadia, grinning together in better times as he organized the last of the documentation. It was a sobering reminder that beneath the surface of even the most apparently flawless lives, there could be currents of suffering, resentment, and anger just waiting to burst. Quan shut the file and turned off his desk lamp with heavy heart. Though the Andreev case was closed, the knowledge it imparted would remain with him always, and he couldn't get rid of the belief that more tales like theirs were just waiting to be unearthed as he left the office that evening.